should give somebody else rights to. You guys will tell me when there's people that need to be let in, eh? You just need to shout because I won't be able to see you. So I'm going to be sharing my screen. All right, today, 2015 student protests. And the students objected about the university system because they said that the university system still had not decolonized. And they were correct. And the question is, why I think around about the end of the 1960s, people had been starting to be pushed out of Africa. Why, so many years later, is Africa still struggling to decolonize itself? What are the issues? Here in South Africa, we thought we would decolonize. I mean, we fought a protracted battle against apartheid. 25 years later, the students needed to protest to get us to decolonize, and we still haven't. And so there are lots of questions about why haven't we decolonized? And what does decolonization mean anyway? So today what we want to talk about is the whole question and the notion of what people call, quote unquote, development. And when they speak in development, the word development itself is a loaded term, because it implies that there's the way in which the dominant narrative around development has been that there's something wrong with Africa. And not that there's something wrong with Africa, but there's something wrong with Africans, that we can't get ourselves to develop. So that's the one narrative. And the narrative around that has been that Africa, and this is the modernization narrative, Africa must modernize. And that has been code for Africa must become more like Europe, or Africa must become more like America, and later on that Africa must become more like developed countries. But that has been the dominant narrative, that we need to move nearer, by God, to thee. There has been what they call revisionist alternatives, where people are starting to say, actually, the problem is much more complex than that. And they are saying that Africa is not just a question of Africa being undeveloped, and that the problem is not that Africa is poor, the problem is that Africa is oppressed. So on the one hand, there's been a movement to develop Africa. On another hand, there are still remnants of the liberation struggle, so people say that we need to liberate Africa. So these are kind of two poles that exist and that you will see within the literature and it comes out in many ways. And these are very big ideologies, these two camps. What we will do today is I'm first going to show you a video, and we're going to be looking at TVET as a concept. And what the video does, it's somebody from a third world country where they started to develop what they call barefoot colleges. In Africa, we tried a couple of things as well. In Zimbabwe, we tried education with production. In Botswana, they tried the Botswana brigades. There was Nyeyeres, Ujuma, and there's the Kulali Chari of Kenya. So there's a number of stuff that we've tried in Kenya. But the question that the Barefoot College poses to us is, does TVET in Africa need to look like TVET elsewhere? Or can we think TVET differently? All right. So one of your predecessors, as she spoke about TVET in Africa, but not TVET for Africa, and she described that as many of the African systems, not just in South Africa, all over the show. One of the issues, and I'm taking a slight detour here, but one of the issues in the comparative literature is that what has happened in the past, and particularly since the 1990s, there's been a lot of what people call policy borrowing, where there have been certain policies that have been floating around the world, and it's almost like there's been a cut and paste of policies, so that there's almost a whole new world order of how education looks. And in this whole new world order, education looks the same all over the show, but some people are starting to say, is this correct? At the end of the day, I have a particular position. You need to develop your own position independently of me. So I will, of course, be punting my particular position. But at the end of the day, you need to arrive at what your own conclusions are around these issues. But the issue that we can look today is TVET. Can TVET help Africa? And if so, what kind of TVET? What kind of TVET should we be looking at? The example that I'm going to share with you now, as soon as I share my screen, is an example from India, and they've also done some work. They've recently been doing some work in Africa as well. But when you talk India, you're not talking the Indian government. You're talking about grassroots India. So I'm going to show you this video so that you can just have an alternative view of this is what TVET is now. This is how we experience TVET. But there are other models as to what TVET can look like. So let me just share my screen. This is from a TEDx talk. It runs for about, I think, about 17 minutes. You can see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
So let me just play this. Let me shut up. I just need to mute my camera.
I'd like to take you to another world. And I'd like to share a 45-year-old love story.
Sorry, can all of you hear this? iPhone, can you all hear the? Okay, cool.
Yes.
Poor, living on less than $1 a day.
So I'm sort up again.
I'd like to take you to another world. And I'd like to share a 45-year-old love story with the poor living on less than $1 a day. I went to a very elitist, snobbish, expensive education in India, and that almost destroyed me. I was all set to be a diplomat, teacher, doctor, all laid out. Then I don't look it, but I was the Indian national squash champion for 3 years. The whole world was laid out for me. Everything was on my feet. Could do nothing wrong. And then I thought out of curiosity, I'd like to go and live in a world, just see what a village is like. In 1965, I went to what is called the worst Bihar famine in India, and I saw starvation, death, people dying of hunger for the first time. Changed my life. Came back home, told my mother, I'd like to live and work in a village. Mother went into a coma. What is this? The whole world is laid out for you, the best jobs are laying out for you, and you want to go and work in a village? I mean, is there something wrong with you? I said, no, I've got the best education, it made me think, and I wanted to give something back in my own way. What do you want to do in a village? No job, no money, no security, no prospect. I said, I want to live and dig wells for 5 years. Dig wells for 5 years? You went to the most expensive school and college in India and you want to dig wells for 5 years? She didn't speak to me for a very long time because she thought I'd let my family down. But then I was exposed to the most extraordinary knowledge and skills that very poor people have, which is never brought into mainstream, which is never identified, respected, applied on a large scale. And I thought I'd start a barefoot college. College only for the poor. What the poor thought was important would be reflected in the college. Went to this village for the first time. Elders came to me and said, "Are you running from the police?" I said, "No." "You failed in your exam?" I said, "No." "You didn't get a government job?" I said, "No." "What are you doing here? Why are you here? The educational system in India makes you look at Paris and Delhi and Zurich. What are you doing in this village? Is there something wrong with you? You're not telling us?" I said, "No, I want to actually start a college only for the poor. What the poor thought was important would be reflected in the college." So then they gave me some very sound and profound advice. They said, "Please, don't bring anyone with a degree and qualification into your college." So it's the only college in India where if you should have a PhD or a master's, you're disqualified to come. You have to be a cop-out or a washout or a dropout to come to our college. You have to work with your hands. You have to have a dignity of labor. You have to show that you have a skill that you can offer the community and provide a service to the community. So we started the Barefoot College and we redefined professionalism. Who is a professional? A professional is someone who has a combination of competence, confidence, and belief. A water diviner is a professional. A traditional midwife is a professional. A traditional bone setter is a professional. These are professionals all over the world. You'll find them in any inaccessible village around the world. And we thought that these people should come into mainstream and show that the knowledge and skills that they have is universal. It needs to be used, needs to be applied, needs to be shown to the world outside that these knowledge and skills are relevant even today. So the college works following the lifestyle and work style of Mahatma Gandhi. You eat on the floor, you sleep on the floor, you work on the floor. There are no contracts, no written contracts. You can stay with me for 20 years, go tomorrow. And no one can get more than $100 a month. You come for the money, you don't come to Barefoot College. You come for the work and the challenge, you come to the Barefoot College. That is where we want you to try crazy ideas. Whatever idea you have, come and try. Doesn't matter if you fail. Battered, bruised, you start again. It's the only college where the teacher is the learner and the learner is the teacher. And it's the only college where you don't give a certificate. You are certified by the community you serve. You don't need a paper to hang on the wall to show that you are an engineer. So when they said that, they said, "Well, show us what is possible, what are you doing? This is all mumbo jumbo if you can't sit on the ground." So we built the first Barefoot College in 1986. It was built by 12 barefoot architects who can't read and write. Built on $1.50 a square foot. 150 people lived there, worked there. They got the Aga Khan Award for Architecture in 2002. But then they suspected, they thought there was an architect behind it. I said, yes, they made the blueprints, but the barefoot architects actually constructed the college. We are the only ones who actually returned the award for $50,000 because they didn't believe us and we thought that they were actually casting aspersions on the barefoot architects that we loved. I asked a forester, high-powered, paper-qualified expert. I said, "What can you build in this place?" He had one look at the soil and said, "Forget it, no way, nothing can work. No water, rocky soil." I was in a bit of a spot. And I said, "Okay, I'll go to the old man in the village and say, what should I grow in this pot?" He looked quietly at me and said, "You build this, you put this, and it'll work." This is what it looks like today. Went to the roof, and all the women said, "Clear out." The men should clear out because we don't want to share this technology with the men. This is waterproofing the roof. It is a bit of jaggery, a bit of urine, a bit of other things I don't know, but it actually doesn't leak. Since 1986, it hasn't leaked. This technology, the women will not share with the men. It's the only college which is fully solar electrified. All the power comes from the sun. 45 kilowatts of panels on the roof, and everything works off the sun for the next 25 years. So long as the sun shines, I have no problem with power. The beauty is that it was installed by a priest, a Hindu priest who's only done 8 years of primary schooling. Never been to school, never been to college. He knows more about solar than anyone I know anywhere in the world. Guaranteed. Food, if you come to the Barefoot College, is solar cooked. But the people who fabricated that solar cooker are women. Illiterate women who actually fabricate the most sophisticated solar cooker. It's a parabolic Scheffler solar cooker. Unfortunately, they're almost half German. It's so precise. You'll never find Indian women so precise. Absolutely to the last inch, you can make that cooker. And we have 60 meals twice a day of solar cooking. We have a dentist. She's a grandmother, illiterate. She's a dentist. She actually looks after the teeth of 7,000 children. Barefoot technology. This was 1986, no engineer, no architect thought of it, but we are collecting rainwater from the roofs. Very little water is wasted. All the roofs are connected underground to a 400,000 liter tank, and no water is wasted. If we have 4 years of drought, we still have water in the campus because we collect rainwater. 60% of children don't go to school because they have to look after animals, sheep, goats, domestic chores. So we thought of starting a school at night for the children. Because the night schools of Thilonia, over 75,000 children have gone through these night schools because it's for the convenience of the child, it's not for the convenience of the teacher. And what do we teach in these schools? Democracy, citizenship, how you should measure your land, what you should do if you're arrested, what you should do if your animal is sick. This is what we teach in the night schools. But all the schools are solar lit. Every 5 years, we have an election between 6 to 14-year-old children participate in a democratic process, and they elect a prime minister. The prime minister is 12 years old. She looks after 20 goats in the morning, but she's prime minister in the evening. She has a cabinet, Minister for Education, Minister for Energy, Minister for Health, and they actually monitor and supervise 150 schools for 7,000 children. She got the World's Children's Prize 5 years ago when she went to Sweden. First time ever going out of a village, never seen Sweden, wasn't dazzled at all by what was happening. And the Queen of Sweden, who was there, turned to me and said, "Can you ask this child where she got her confidence from? She's only 12 years old. She's not dazzled by anything." And the girl who's on her left turned to me and looked at the Queen straight in the eye. Said, "Please tell her I'm the Prime Minister." Where the percentage of illiteracy is very high, we use puppetry. Puppet is the way we communicate. You have Joachim Chacha, who's 300 years old. He's my psychoanalyst, he's my teacher, he's my doctor, he's my lawyer, he's my donor. He actually raises money, solves my disputes. He solves my problems in the village. If there's tension in the village, if the attendance in the schools go down and there's a friction between the teacher and the parent, the puppet calls the teacher and the parent in front of the whole village and says, "Shake hands, the attendance must not drop." These puppets are made out of recycled World Bank reports. So this decentralized, demystified approach of solar electrifying villages We've covered all over India, from Ladakh up to Bhutan. All solar electrified villages by people who have been trained. And we went to Ladakh and we asked this woman, this at -40, you have to come out of the roof because there's no place to, it was all snowed up on both sides. And we asked this woman, what is the benefit you had from solar electricity? She thought for a minute and said, it's the first time I can see my husband's face in winter. Went to Afghanistan. One lesson we learned in India was men are untrainable. Men are restless, men are ambitious, men are compulsively mobile, and they all want a certificate. All across the globe, you have this tendency of men wanting a certificate. Why? Because they want to leave the village and go to a city looking for a job. So we came up with a great solution. Train grandmothers. What's the best way of communicating in the world today? Television? No. Telegraph? No. Telephone? No. Tell a woman. So we went to Afghanistan for the first time. And we picked 3 women and said, we want to take them to India. They said, impossible. They don't even go out of their room, then you want to take them to India. I said, I'll make a concession. I'll take the husbands along as well. So I took the husbands along. Of course, the women were much more intelligent than the men. 6 months. How do we train these women? Sign language. You don't use the written word. You don't use the spoken word. You use sign language. And in 6 months, they can become solar engineers. They go back and solar electrify their own village. This woman went back and solar electrified the first village. Set up a workshop. The first village ever to be solar electrified in Afghanistan were by the 3 women. This woman is an extraordinary grandmother, 55 years old, and she solar electrified 200 houses for me in Afghanistan. And they haven't collapsed. She actually went and spoke to an engineering department in Afghanistan and told the head of a department the difference between AC and DC. You know. Those 3 women are trained. 27 more women and solar electrified 100 villages in Afghanistan. We went to Africa and we did the same thing. All these women sitting in one table from 8, 9 countries, all chatting to each other, not understanding a word because they're all speaking a different language. But their body language is great. They're speaking to each other and actually becoming solar engineers. I went to Sierra Leone and there was this minister driving down at the dead of night, comes across this village, comes back, goes into the village, says, what's the story? They said, these 2 grandmothers. Grandmothers? Minister couldn't believe what was happening. Where did they go? Went to India and back. Went straight to the president. He said, do you know there's a solar electrified village in Sierra Leone? He said, no. Half the cabinet went to see the grandmothers the next day. What's the story? So he summoned me and said, can you train me 150 grandmothers? I said, I can't, Mr. President, but they will. Grandmothers will. So he built me the first barefoot training center in Sierra Leone. And 150 grandmothers are being trained in Sierra Leone. Gambia. Went to select a grandmother in Gambia. Went to this village, I knew which woman I would like to take. The community got together and said, I'll take these 2 women. I said, no, I'm going to take this woman. I said, why? She doesn't know the language, you don't know her. I said, no, I like the body language, I like the way she speaks. Difficult husband, not possible. Call the husband. Husband came. Swaggering, politician, mobile in his hand, not possible. Why not? The woman, look how beautiful she is. I said, yeah, she's very beautiful. What happens if she runs off with an Indian man? That was the biggest fear. I said, she'll be happy, she'll bring up in a mobile. She went like a grandmother and came back like a tiger. She walked out of the plane and spoke to the whole press as if she was a veteran. She handled the national press and she was a star. And when I went back 6 months later, I said, where's your husband? Oh, somewhere, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Success story. I will just wind up by saying, and I think you don't have to look for solutions outside. Look for solutions within and listen to people. They have the solutions in front of you all over the world. Don't even worry. Don't listen to the world bank. Listen to the people on the ground. They have all the solutions in the world. I'll end with a quotation by Mahatma Gandhi. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. Thank you.
How do I get this thing out? All right. In the chat, can you all hear me? Oops, stop presenting.
Yes, we can.
You can all
Yes,
hear me.
we can.
In the chat,
Yeah.
write down a couple of thoughts. First impressions of the video. Critical, positive, whatever.
You said we should write.
Just write in the chat. Give you a couple of impressions. Positive, negative, it's up to you.
I've never wrote anything. I want you to show me where should I write.
Check on your right hand side, Musiwa.
Yeah, in the chat.
Right
You know
hand
where the chat is?
No.
If you go to the bottom left, right hand corner, if you're on a computer, I don't know how it works.
I'm on the phone.
Or you're on a
I'm
phone.
on the phone.
Let me see if my phone can get into this. But for the people on my phone died. So I can get my wife's phone quickly. But for the people on the computer, it's on the bottom right hand side. There's a little speaker button. Share your thoughts. Say, what did you like?
Oh, sure,
I'm going to see if I can find a solution for John.
you call messages.
It's on the chat section.
Okay, I saw it. Thank you.
You got it. Excellent, excellent.
Thank you.
Shabiluni is still typing. I'll just wait for him. Okay. The rest of you, you can add your comments as we go along. Eh? Are there any broad comments that I think I'm getting some of the gist of it? You know what stood out for me is how different the vision and almost the underlying philosophy was of the Barefoot College and what I suspect is happening at TVT colleges. And so what may be interesting, I only just thought of this now, is to have a look at what does the white paper say, what does Bunker Roy say, and then a third column is what do I say. And oftentimes, this is how a little academic literacy pun quickly. Oftentimes we use the technique of they say, I say. So white paper says, Bunker Roy says on the same issue, my conclusion. Where do I stand on the matter? So there's a lot in the video. I'm not even sure I'll be able to cover it. But I think that we should come back to the video often. And I'm going to copy all these comments so I can post it out to people, because I think we need to start discussing what kind of TVET does Africa need in order for what is CB's favorite little phrase is African solutions for African problems. You know, what are some of the other phrases? I suppose Africa for the Africans. We are our own liberators. Was a popular phrase. Right. How do we look? I think it was John who spoke about, How do we look for solutions within? No, the Skulikani. The solutions within. What solutions do we have already amongst us? Okay. Well, Maluse's comment is interesting. They are solving problems, not finding a way of solving problems through TVET. And interestingly enough, Malusi, is that what they are doing is in fact TVET, but it's not the same TVET that we have. They're doing TVET, because TVET is technical and vocational training, right? So they are doing technical training, they are doing vocational training, but not in the same way that we have. So one of the interesting points, for example, is that the people who come to their TVET college, because we're complaining about the people who are coming to our TVET college, they can't learn because they don't have, their schooling is inadequate, etc. And there's problems with schooling. Those people who come to their college don't have schooling. Oftentimes they are actually illiterate. And yet they can still cope with TVET. So what is different about their system? And is this, does this solve South Africa's problems? Or does it only solve a part of the problem? Is it the solution? Is it a partial solution? Should we maintain TVET or should we be changing TVET? These are all debates. And like everything, it's a debate. I think that maybe what we should do now, unless, does anybody have any comments to offer? I've already put some of your comments, but does anybody feel that there's a burning comment that they would like to offer?
Yes,
Yes, Tim.
yes.
It's on that order.
Okay. For myself, I believe we need more of agricultural types of colleges, because if you look in Africa, Africa itself is the richest continent, but then the poverty is asked in Africa. Poverty is found in Africa. And currently the situation, people are moving away from villages, coming to the city, but when they're in the city, they become, I don't want to use the wrong words anyway, but they're still human beings, but they are suffering. But the only issue is what? Is poverty. They leave the place where there's a land where they can just, plant something and survive on that and supply the shops and all those things. But in the city, they are suffering. There's enough land in the villages, but everyone is moving. But you find a child that just grew in the flats or something, they are doing the opposite, because they want to go to the villages where there's land and stuff. So in the situation, for example, I can move from the village and come to the city. You find that in the city, I'm staying in the shack, but I left the whole a big land in my area with a big house, but I'm just suffering. But is there also no progress? I have to work for little money, even if it's not little money, but at the end, I must take the very same money and go to ShopRite and buy food, of which I could have planted in my area. But in the situation now, we are just doing the opposite of just, instead of staying in our own villages, we move to the city. That is a belief that we have, as if in the city there's more things, but we find it's less actually. It's only poverty and troubles. Thank you.
John, you're going to say something.
Oh, yes, Tim. I actually wanted to say that what I took from the video was that the ladies there were never given a theoretical concept of how to develop those solar system, but then they were given some sort of a skill transfer, of which what they were given was very much beneficial to their community and all that. But looking at how TVET is being structured, I have a cousin of mine who attended TVET a long time ago, and he was doing penal beating, but he by then he only had like a grade 9. So by then they did not offer too much of theoretical concept, but more of practical work wherein they obtained the 12-week course for penal beating. And they do have levels of which at the end it was beneficial to him to sustain him and his family, and he worked at BMW and South African Police Service penal beating the cars, and now he has his own company and things are moving well for him. It is beneficial for him. So I feel like when we take students that are not performing well in the theoretical part, and maybe they are performing well in the skills part, and we say maybe they are failing because of they fail maths and they fail the theoretical part, instead of having a portion in a TVET sector where we can actually have only a skill transfer so that they can survive on their own with that type of skill, have piece jobs, fix electrical appliances around the community so that it can actually sustain themselves. But then if we only focusing on the theoretical part and judge them based on theoretical part and not maybe based on their skills, it becomes a challenge in the community.
And this takes us back to that debate on how much skills people need. So it's the whole new vocationalism. Should we be going the new vocationalism route? To what extent does it deal with the demands of Africa? But it's a question of what kind of Africa we want to build. Do we need people who's gonna innovate? So are we going to compete with the global world? Should we be competing with the global world? It's a minefield. It's a minefield. One of the things I just want to note also that John, in slight disagreement with what you're saying, not entirely, that these grandmas actually have a strong theoretical understanding of what's happening. Remember that one stage she said that this grandma went to explain to one of these engineers what the difference is between AC and DC. Remember there was also that section, but they learned theory. Our understanding is that people should learn practice through theory. What was happening there, it seems as though people were learning theory through practice. They were doing it the other way around. So it is possible for people to learn maths and to learn theory and to learn how electrical circuits work. I still don't know the difference between AC and DC. I just know it was Tesla versus Edison. That's the sum total of what I know. But people understanding these differences because they could see and touch and feel it is a big thing. Another big difference, I'm just going to punt something at that my wife has been punting. She says, the whole TVET system is geared at youngsters. But in Africa, the majority of adults haven't had an opportunity to get some kind of education. Well, they haven't completed the education, in terms of the formal schooling. And what opportunities are we providing for adults, parents in particular, to find and develop a particular skill that they have? But anyway, I said this whole video, it's layered. There are so many different layers to the video. You don't have to agree with everything Banker Roy says. And obviously, he's promoting his particular project. But there's a lot in that that he spoke about that appealed to me. I want to take us a break until 8 o'clock. So you can just stretch a little bit, grab a cup of coffee or something like that. And when we come back, what I'm going to be presenting are different theories of what they call development. And then we can see where does our college fit at the moment? What are the things that we believe? Where do those beliefs come from? Because there are lots of beliefs that are flowing around, but those beliefs often come from somewhere. And once we know what belief systems there are out there, we can decide to either choose that belief system that we currently have or choose to look at it differently. But the point, I think, of all studies is for us to get options, for us to understand that there are other ways of seeing the world, and then not have a decision imposed on you, but to make that decision yourself. So, but I'm going to break now until 8 o'clock, and then when we come back, and then we can then I'll look at the at some of the theories that Frank Youngman, who's a lecturer at the University of Botswana, some of the theories that he presents. All right, see you at 8. All right, just grab a cup of coffee. I'll see you guys all a bit later. Bye. Sorry, was that understood? We're taking a break until 8 o'clock. Sorry. Ja, okay, it's fine. But ik heb hier samen. Ik ga zoeken bij ons samen. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Let me just see that. Hi, can you guys hear me? So I put in my.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Are you speaking to me? I just want to, because I can't hear you guys. There's something wrong with my earphones.
Now you can hear us.
Oh, okay. Let me unplug my earphones then. All right. So now I'm going to introduce you to some of the theoretical work. This is mainly by, sorry, let me just ask somebody to close the door. So this is some of the theoretical work by done by Frank Youngman. And he was writing about this stuff. Let me just show my face. People like to see my face for some reason. And Right. All right. So towards the end of the 1990s, and lots of us came out of that 1985, those heady days, you know, where there were lots of anti-imperialist struggles and that kind of thing all over the show. And we just come out of that post-colonial period. And people starting to have this journal called, what was it, the Review of the African Political Economy, and they called it, you know, right? So that was a big review. They were looking at there was a debt crisis in Africa that people were speaking about. People started to speak about imperialism. There was a whole language that they went ahead, and of course, those times it was still, you know, the Eastern Bloc. Russia was still a big bloc, and it was still kind of in the Cold War era. So there's all those kind of politics happening in Africa. And Frank Young, when writing out of Botswana, then started to say, let's look at the different competing theories of development, because we always think of, you know, there's one way in which development can happen, and he says actually these are not just different ideas about how development can happen; these are different ideologies. And that lots of development theory has got a political agenda behind it, and we need to recognize what that political agenda is. So for your purposes, what you need to understand is that you need to be able to recognize what kind of development theory, when anybody speaks, what kind of development theory is being used. So you need to understand the development theory, and then you need to be able to apply it within your particular circumstance. So let's look at development theory generally, and then we can bring it back to TVET. He was speaking out of an adult education context, but I think that lots of the stuff applies. One of the things I must warn you, this is a health warning, is that the reading is one of those readings that you need to sit with a pen and a paper and think about it. All right, you need to read the document and say, oh, okay, this is what they're trying to say here. So what I'm going to do, even before you read the document, because you do need to read this, you do need to read the article in quite a bit of detail, and I'll send you the article. There's a link in the article in Canva, but I think I'll email it to you as well. But when you read the document, what I'm going to do for you now is to just give you what are the big ideas in the document, right? And do a kind of a summary. But you have to read the document, because there's a lot of detail in the document that you need to go through. The same like the Bankeroy video. Your first impression was good, doesn't necessarily go into the nitty-gritty. There's a lot happening in there. All right. But what I'm going to do is just give you the big picture. So, what you will need to know, there's about, let me see, about 30 things that you probably need to get out of the document. 4 times 6, 20, 24 at least. You will need to know that Youngman has identified 5 different development theories. I suppose 2 are the dominant narrative, what people are saying, what you will hear everywhere. And 3 are revisionist theories. We're only going to look at 2 of them. Right? He spends the rest of the book discussing his favorite one. We will look at 2. So we will look today at 4 theories, and we will mention a 5th. Right? You need to identify what those 4 theories are and how they differ. So that's the first thing. And for each theory, we will be looking at 6 things. 1, how did that theory come about? Whose theory is it? Why did they use that particular theory? Right? Theories don't come around just because people thought, this is a nice thing for us to think. There's an agenda. And so you must know whose agenda and what agenda is being promoted by that particular theory. And then obviously, now that you know who's the theory, what the political agenda is behind it, what are the main ideas of that theory. What drives the theory? How will you recognize that this person is speaking a particular theory, neoliberalism or modernization, populism, or whatever? Right? What are the main ideas that, how will you recognize people who say that theory? The third thing that they will be looking at is, if you adopt this theory, what kind of strategies does the theory propose? So how does it say Africa needs to develop? And some of them don't like the word development, by the way. But how do they need to say that? What should Africa be doing? How should we go about getting Africa to the point that Africa needs to be at? What kind of solutions should we be looking at? So that's in the first three things. Right? Then he takes a bit of a turn and say, okay, these are the facts. Now let's look at what evidence there is, not what evidence there is, but what impact there's been. So what is the impact that this theory has had on social action? Right. So there's a theory, has it had an impact? Also, some of the theories, all of the theories have weaknesses. Bunker Roy comes from a particular theoretical background. What are the weaknesses of what Bunker Roy is saying? The white paper comes from a particular theoretical background. What are the weaknesses of that theory? And then finally, we will work at now how, and we'll bring it back home, back to education, back to TVT. How is that theory used by education movements? All right. So bear those 6 questions in mind when you look at each of those theories. Okay. But just to give you an overall, and I think I've said this point, is that for Youngman, this whole notion of development theory is not neutral or value-free. Development theory, all theory, is political. There's a political agenda behind any theory. Okay. So here's your 5 theories. The first 2 theories, these are the mainstream theories, are modernization theory and neoliberal theory. Oopsie. See that? Right. So it's modernization theory and neoliberal theory. The next group of theories are your revisionist theories. These are the alternatives to modernization and neoliberalism. It's populism, dependency theory, and then Young's favorite political one. We won't look at political economy. I think it's very much, it just goes a bit further on dependency theory. All right. So those are the 5 theories that we're going to be looking at. And for each of the 5 theories, we'll look at those 6 different categories of thought. What is the agenda? Where are they coming from? And what does it mean for us? Firstly, this is the ground level of theory. I think it's where modern development theory came. And if you look at its history, and if you read Youngman, he developed at a particular point in time where there were post-colonial states that were starting developing. People were starting to get their independence. And Youngman's view is that suddenly the West woke up and they started to say, oh, we need a development theory. So see how you could have had a development theory while you were still colonizing the countries. But okay, let's do a development theory now. But his suspicion is that they were doing development theory so that they could have an alternative to the threat of communism at the time. And so they developed this development theory and saying, look, you can develop through capitalism. You don't have to go communist or anything like that. So that was their argument. And the theory coming out of the West was that if you want to go and if you want your country to be free and your country to be developed, there is a single process of social revolution, of social evolution. And it's not revolution. It needs to be evolution. And this is around the work of somebody called Rastow, if I remember correctly. Yeah. where he said that if you follow the pattern, oops, spelled wrongly, but if you follow the pattern of Britain, you can follow the same path and you can be just like us. So there's a path by which you will evolve, and that path is the same like us. You can be like us too, Africa. Later on, because there were certain moves in Europe as well, where the workers in Europe started to gain certain rights and becoming powerful. So they started to develop this idea of the welfare state in America, in Europe, where people started to argue for a welfare state. And they were saying that you don't have to become communists and what have you. The state will look after you, the welfare state. Capitalism will produce enough wealth, and you can go on welfare, and the state will make sure that it gets involved. And so during that time, and I mean we had some of that in South Africa as well. All the school fees were paid for. You had Eskom was producing electricity for the nation. You didn't really have to. You had to pay for it, but not nominal amounts. But the state was responsible for providing water. The state was responsible for making sure that the trains ran on time. The state was responsible for everything. That was the notion of the welfare state, and that was modernization theory. And it happened at a time when they had in Europe at least, they had what they call a full employment economy. So this is before the system collapsed, the financial system collapsed internationally. So they said, look, the state will look after you. You don't have to have a revolution and that kind of stuff. We will look after you. And what they argued for at the time, and people, none of you may remember this, but when I was young, they had a strong centralized education system. And they even made significant investments in education. People used to go to the department used to send us textbooks. I had to pay $950 for all my books. But the department provided textbooks, they provided these little mathematical sets, they provided writing books, and everything was provided. And of course, some schools were more privileged than others, but yeah, that was the idea. And interesting enough, what was happening then is that there was rising social demand. So the more the state gave, the more people wanted, in a sense, which I suppose ironic, and they were probably kicking themselves. And one of the ironies is, and they pick people like Ronald Doe and then pick this up. One of the ironies is, the more people became educated, the more educated they needed to become. There's what they call diploma inflation. So, because everybody had a matric, well, not everybody, but in some countries, because more people had matric, the value of the matric dropped. So the more people had matric, the more the value of matric dropped. And so people being educated and unemployed. So for example, in India, more and more people were getting degrees. So after a while, you needed a degree to drive a bus. There was this diploma inflation. The more education there was, the more companies decided that you need to have higher education for jobs that you already were doing. But even within this space, I mean, modernization wasn't a single thing. There were certain things that would start to develop. So modernization started to think about non-formal education, similar to what Banker Roy and them are doing. But for them, it was driven from above. Everything was driven from above. And that's where there's a fundamental difference between them and Banker Roy. Right? Because he's saying that things need to be driven from below, that the people themselves have the solutions within. They're saying that the state needs to rescue everybody from poverty. And what they tended to do then was they focused on, there was a large focus on technical issues, planning, finance, teacher training, but it's all from the top and it's all technical. And we can solve the problems with technical issues. So none of the technical issues were actually political issues, they were technical issues. it became a question of us working things out. And people started to speak about the technicist approach to education problems, that we turn political issues into technical issues. So that was the first big theory. That's where modernization came. 1972, this all fell apart. There was an oil crisis, there was massive inflation, the economy collapsed. The system kind of goes through a system of booms and busts. And suddenly, there wasn't enough money to go around anymore. And so a new theory came. Oopsie. No, sorry, I jumped the slide ahead. So just to get what are the main points are. You will recognize a modernization theory when you see things or words like, we need to meet people's basic needs. We need to speak about poverty alleviation. You'll be able to read and you can read this yourself in Young Men. In fact, I want you to read it yourself so that you can get it under your own bag. What are the strategies that modernization proposes? And what was its impact on education? Have a look, because this is a big discussion. What are the weaknesses that modernization has? And I'm going to open up, if Canva is up and running, I'm going to open up a discussion point so that you guys can submit a little assignment on what are the weaknesses of modernization. Because it sounds wonderful, the state will look, because that's what we all want. We've all been saying we want. The state will look after everybody. We're going to go back to the old days where colleges were paid for by the state. Did you know that colleges didn't used to have school fees? That wasn't a thing. It only became a thing in 1994. School fees weren't something that people paid at school either. Only in 1994 did that become a thing, when they started to say these are state-supported colleges and these are state-owned colleges. I think there was a phrase, something like that. Yeah, it was in 1994. Right. But out of this, the main point that they argued, modernization theory, and maybe this is the takeaway, is that the ideology behind modernization theory is that countries are undeveloped or are not developed because of their internal characteristics. There's something wrong with that country. So the way that we will become developed is that we need to address the education needs. We need more educated and skilled people. And the reason why we're not developed is because our people are not educated and our people are not skilled. Or we don't have enough infrastructure, or our government is corrupt. So there's a whole lot of stuff they're saying that the reason why we're not developed is our fault. We need to come to the party. We need to follow this route out of development. We need to become more like Singapore, or like the UK, or like America, or like Germany. That's how we will develop, if we become more like these other people. What then happened? Around about in 1995, this whole thing came undone. I think that on one hand, we're still not sure what happened, or I'm still not sure what happened, but at a certain point in time, the thinking took a right turn. The Nobel Prize started to go to all these crackheads from the Chicago school and what have you, with their loony ideas. This is me taking a line. And the Nobel Prize was used in order to promote a certain political agenda. Right? And that was the agenda of this neoliberal theory. And they gave a lot of Nobel prizes to all these neoliberal thinkers, free marketeers. And it was a rightwards turn. And the people who led this rightwards turn in governments, they are associated with Maggie Thatcher in Britain and Ronald Reagan in the USA. And one of the things that they did as they then started to wage an attack on the state and on the welfare system, and they said that the state is inefficient. We need to get rid of the state. We need to go with markets. Markets will ensure everything. We need to have a free economy. Ronald Reagan used to speak about the trickle-down economy. And so there was this whole critique of modernization theory. It says, no, the state cannot look after the poor. We need to find ways for the poor to become entrepreneurial so they can look after themselves. And their premise, right, this is the idea that drives their thought. I remember with the modernization people, they had a particular idea that drove their thought, and their idea was that there's basic needs, and if we can solve the internal problems, then we can follow this route. They were saying no. The neoliberals were saying something different. They say that the only way that we can ensure a productive economy is through the market. We need to tax the rich less. And if we tax the rich less, then they will start to produce wealth, and that wealth will trickle down to the masses. Right? But we need to look at wealth creation. We need to open up the markets, right? Because it's bad for inflation and all those kind of things. And these things never really materialize in that particular way, but you know that. But they were saying that we need to follow a business model. Education, and for education, it meant that education needed to meet the needs of business. The better business does, the better the country does. And that in a kind of common sense way is what they're saying. If business does well, everybody does well. And the state is inefficient. We need to unbundle the state. It's just become a problem. And it's pushing up inflation and all those kind of stuff. It's bad for the economy. We need to do whatever's right for the economy. You look after the economy, everything else will look after itself. All right. So one of the things that they were proposing, for example, is small government. They said we need to do away with big government. We need small government. Education, what they were doing is they say we need to open up education to the markets. And there were lots of ways that they did this. They will say that if an institution is doing well, they will be able to charge fees. So what had happened, for example, in South Africa, just to give you an example of how it started to impact on our thought. All the schools, which previously were kind of free to an extent, it was the state provided education. And unfortunately, they gave more money to some people because of the color of their skin than other people, but the state provided education. What happened now is they had a different system, and in the old days they called them Section 21 schools. What were they called? Were any of you around that time? They changed the name of the schools, man. Remember they used to call them white schools, they said they're Model C schools. You had the introduction of what they call Model C schools. Model C schools, and it started just out for the white schools, because they discovered that the government could no longer afford the schools, mainly because they cut government spending, and they wanted to tax, they wanted to reduce taxes. When you reduce taxes, the government doesn't have money, it can't spend the money because the taxes have been reduced. So there were two things that happened. The first thing is that there was cost cutting. So it became a user pays model. People had to pay for their own education. And so schools, there was this new thing that schools could now start charging fees. And that was new. The second thing that happened is that in order the deal that they then struck with the parents to say that we will give you autonomy that you will run your school. So you will get to make the decisions, but you will pay for those decisions as well. Right. So the state then said, we will give a certain amount of money, but each school can do its own thing. Right? And so they gave the schools over to the school governing bodies. And those were Model C schools. They said some schools are not able to run themselves yet, so we will continue to look after the schools and we will fund those schools. But the schools that can run themselves, they can go out and they can be a little bit more entrepreneurial. They can go and they can look for sponsorships, they can push up their school fees, they can sell, they can have bazaars, and they can sell stuff. You know, there's all of the stuff that you can do, and we will give you as parents the autonomy to do that. Come 1994, the Model C school then gets rolled out to everybody, and now everybody becomes a Model C school. So all the schools can charge fees, but some schools, because of their student pool, cannot charge as much fees as other schools. So, for example, my wife and I, we had made a kind of an in principle decision that we were going to put our kids into the community school, right? Because we didn't want to take our money out of the area. That school had 45 students in a class, right? The school fees, I think that the school fees were like 1,000 Rand a year. When I took the kids out, after a while, we realized, because I know one of my colleagues then told me, oh, so you also made that mistake. And then for other reasons, we didn't have a choice. We had to put our kids in another school because it was, they had else difficulties. And so then we put them into another school. And the other school on the other side of the railway line, this school charged 2,500 Rand a month as opposed to 1,000 Rand a year. So just think about it. In my child's class in the other school, there were 45 kids, right? 45 multiplied by 2,500 Rand every month extra that school had to spend. So that was the education gap. So certain people were able to fund schools to a particular amount and other people not. So those are kind of the things that were happening under neoliberal theory. And by the way, the same thing, the same model that they had the Model C schools, they then transferred this model, and this model went over to the colleges as well, because the colleges were previously funded by the state. Colleges now also were, there was a word that they gave for it, but I've forgotten it now, but it was state-owned and state-supported, something like that. But there was 1994, the legislation came out. And so some colleges, and it was mainly the white colleges basically, then had freedom to start charging fees and to run their own affairs. They were given a certain amount of freedom. So that's the way that the neoliberal theory affected things here in South Africa. But there were other things as well. The other thing that came out of that, they said that in places like the USA, they went even further and they said we need to privatize education. We need to open up education to the market. So education itself became a business. And so you had far more people coming out, and all these private schools started to come up. But the main changes were cost sharing, that the user must help to pay for the schools, and decentralization, so that all colleges now have their own college council, who are now able to take the lead. But you will see that when neoliberal theory comes about, there are some of the catchphrases that you will see. They'll speak about privatization. So we've had neoliberal theory, by the way, is not limited to education. There's been privatization of Eskom, privatization of all your state-owned enterprise. Eskom, South African Airways, ISCO, we've just sold off completely. The railway, I think, falls under PRAS. I think they privatize that as well. So a whole lot of this, what previously used to belong to the state, the housing, right? All these things are now put out to tender. So it's not something that the state doesn't provide housing anymore. The state pays somebody else to build the houses. So somebody makes money in the process. money changes hands. The state just provides money to somebody else to do it. The state doesn't control that thing themselves. So that's a shift. So there's a whole lot of deregulation and saying, no, the state won't do this. There's a whole lot of privatization. Those are some of the things that are happening under neoliberal theory. And the impact of this has been almost universal. I think maybe the Scandinavian states have escaped it, and probably the Eastern Bloc as well, but not even them. But certainly in the third world, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund in particular insisted in intervening in the policies of the third world and telling them this is how they must do it, or this is how they must run things. Because they said this is good economic theory. And if you didn't believe the good economic theory, the World Bank would withhold its support, the IMF would hold support. And one of the things that they do is that there's these international rating agencies. They devalue your currency. They say you're not following sound economic theory. And the only sound economic theory they held was neoliberal economic theory. So if you didn't follow the theory, they would devalue your currency because you're not doing things very well, as far as they're concerned. Right. And this had a huge influence on the way in which you do education. So the way in which education happens is that the state doesn't have as much people working for it as they used to. So your D8 is quite a bit smaller, and they have to do quite a bit. There's a lot of cost recovery happening, and this is happening in different parts of the world, which means that the user is paying. So there's more student fees involved. There's a belief in private sector training, so there's much more opening up to markets. The whole notion of sorry.
Are you able to remove the pop-up there?
I am trying to. Let me see. Oh, there I can move it. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks you.
Sorry. So there's more user pays, more income generation. There's more of that kind of stuff that is happening when it comes to neoliberal theory. Right? And there's also more private sector training. I don't know if you guys have more of those private colleges happening in your area, but there's an ideological belief that private and business is better than state. And that kind of comes through in their thinking, because they're saying that if we contribute to, people must contribute towards their own education, the user must pay, the state can contribute, but we must open it up to the market. And there's lots of marketization of education. It's about how does the institution make money. Right? So the institutions, in a sense, turn into businesses. So that broadly is a very skewed, slanted view of neoliberal theory, but that's neoliberal theory. So those are the two dominant theories. Modernization came along. Modernization said there's a route that you can also become a developed state, as they call it. And they used to speak about developing countries, developed countries, undeveloped countries, so there was that language came around. The neoliberals came around, and they're saying, we agree with everything in the modernization, except that the state can't carry the burden anymore. Right? And so you need to adopt sound economic policies. We need to privatize much more. We need to open up things to the market. Right? Because business is good. We need to meet the needs of industry, etc. And colleges need to support business, and colleges even need to provide business opportunities for people. So the way we can get out of it is entrepreneurship and all this kind of stuff. So that is a particular ideology. Right? Those two theories belong to theories of the line. But even in the 1970s, there were alternatives to this, to modernization theory. And these were largely, I think that the dependency theory people were largely on leftists. And so you'll have people like Paulo Freire coming out of them, out of this thinking. And also people on the African continent as well were kind of on this dependency theory. I think that Walter Rodney was probably the major, I think he was a Caribbean writer. probably the major theory where he speaks about how Europe underdeveloped Africa. And Frank Sweezy was also writing about this stuff. So there are a lot of people who were saying that this whole modernization theory it's wrong. They're saying that Africa is not poor, Africa is oppressed. The Rastafarians had a word that says Africa is not oppressed, Africa is downpressed. And they were arguing, here's the fundamental premise. You'll see point number 3. That in Africa, you didn't have a post-colonial state, you had a neo-colonial state. And that the development of Africa was being actively blocked by the West. Africa was being kept down. So, raw materials, it was basically a labor camp. So they needed cheap labor, they'd send them to Africa, they'd send them to, and not just Africa, Latin America, South Asia. So they needed raw materials, raw minerals, they'd get them from Africa for cheap and sell them for expensive. Right? They needed cheap labor, they'd open up plants and what have you, not plants, like BMW plants and Toyota plants, you know, so they'd open up factories in Africa, in China to an extent, in India, where they could pay the workers less and take profits out of the country. So they didn't speak about people investing in the country. They would use a different language for the same thing, but they would use a different language. They wouldn't speak about investors, they would speak about imperialists. They would say that the people who invest in your country, they're not investing in your country, they are taking more money out of your country than they're putting in. They're actually mining all your minerals and they're taking it home and they're making money out of it. And so Africa was becoming increasingly dependent on Europe. And that was deliberate. That is an attempt to keep Africa in a state of permanent dependence. And Africa was being lent money via the World Bank and the IMF and other structures that there was no way that they could pay back. So what Africa was then caught up in was this constant debt crisis, where they constantly had to pay back debt. We inherited from the apartheid state, we inherited 148 billion rands worth of debt, which we spent for a long time, I think, right into Mbeki's regime. I think we were paying 50% of the state's budget was just to service our debt, because they wanted to get rid of the debt quickly. So they didn't write the debt off. We still had to pay back the debt the apartheid government owed. Similarly, in other African countries, they don't have the kind of the mineral resources and the industrial infrastructure, I suppose, that we do. So they weren't able to pay back their debt, and they're constantly caught in this debt crisis. The goods that we sell in Africa are sold cheaply. So even though we produce the coffee in the world, Starbucks sells the coffee. Even though we produce the grains, Kellogg's sells the grains. So we produce the cheap and they produce the manufactured products. We don't have in our country the ability for our country to innovate. We had one innovator was Mark Shuttleworth, for example. And what they did with Mark Shuttleworth is they bought his stuff over so that it no longer belongs to Africa. It now belongs to somewhere in America. And he made a lot of money out of the process. But that innovation no longer belongs here. And there's also what they call the brain drain. And I think that Banker Roy alluded to it, is that you train Africans so that you can take the best and ship them over to America and England so they can develop their economies over there. And so there's a constant process by which development in the third world, it's not just big Africa, in the third world generally, is blocked. We only assemble cars. We do not invent cars. We do not design new cars. We don't have any design products here in Africa. We assemble, and so we kind of the labor labor factory, the labor barracks of the developed countries. And we haven't been able to do anything other than that. Oops, sorry. We haven't been able to do anything other than that because that's the way the world has been sorted out. They will sort out, they will decide what the price is for stuff. We will simply provide the goods. So, for example, computers cost more than the products, the stuff that you need to make the computers with. So we're sitting on the platinum, etc., which you need for the new industrial revolution, but we're not necessarily the beneficiaries of that. Right? And so this is the argument of the dependency theory people. So that's the one part. They're arguing about something which they call imperialism. But the second thing that they argue is they're saying that in the neo-colonial state, colonialism, their argument goes, colonialism was too expensive for the European states to maintain. So they left, and they left black people in charge of a country which still belonged to them. And so they got what they call the local elite, what they call the comprador bourgeoisie. I think that's the word that Ria uses. So it's people in this country who work for their countries, who got outside masters, but in return, they will take their cut. So their cut can be either in the form of tenders, where they become billionaires in their own right, or it can be in the form of them being able to feed off the state coffers. But you have the development of a local elite who will protect international interests in the country on behalf of those international interests. They are a caretaker elite. And they're arguing that lots of these local elites don't actually work for the people in the ground, they actually work for their masters overseas and for themselves. And so they are saying that they don't speak about developed countries and developing countries, they speak about underdeveloped countries. And their argument is that these underdeveloped countries, it's not that they did not develop, it's that they could not develop, and they probably will never be allowed to develop unless they start taking hold of power for themselves, unless they learn how to become independent. So their arguments that Africa is still a dependent economy, that we are what they call a neo-colonial economy. It's the new form of colonialism. And some of them call it imperialism. All right. And so what they would be saying about modernization, they're saying that modernization, and here's a word you'd probably come across, that modernization they saw as being Eurocentric. That the whole notion of modernization is to serve the interests of Europe, and it looks at Africa through the eyes of Europeans instead of through the eyes of Africans. Number one. Secondly, the other critique that they have of modernization is that modernization is in denial of colonialism. It denies that colonialism happened, that colonialism continues to have an impact on Africa even today. Right? Let's put Africa back, etc. They say, look, it's been 25 years since apartheid. You guys must just get your story sorted out now. Stop blaming apartheid for stuff that happened to you. So there's this kind of denialism happening, and that is part of it. And it denies that colonialism and this inequality still exists today. And finally, it ignores, just besides the ravages of colonialism, it ignores the continued inequality that happens in society today. So this is their critique of modernization. They say that modernization theory, it eviscerates the experience of African people, that the experience of African people was not just, colonialism happened so many years ago. They say colonialism is something that's still happening to us today. In a different way, it still has effects on us, but not only still has effects on us, colonialism is alive and well and living in Africa right now. So that's dependency theory. It's an alternative. And so you will see words, not like undeveloped, but you will see words like underdeveloped. They will speak about things like oppressed. They won't speak about the poor, they will speak about the oppressed. You will see words in some of their thinking at the time. This is quite an old theory. You'd see some of them were speaking at the time about socialist revolution, because socialism was the flavor of the day in the left. But more recently, you'll see words like from people like Samira Min about de-linking from the world economy. They'll speak about self-reliance. They'll speak about losing the controls of foreign capital. And by the way, interesting enough, the Ukraine may provide an opportunity for people to break away from the dollar. It's unexpected opportunity, but it may be an opportunity. But anyway, that's speculation on my part. But that's the kind of strategy that they'll be speaking about. They'll speak about how can Africa become self-reliant. How do we cut ourselves out of a market which is designed to keep us down, right? Where we will constantly be minus within the system. So that's kind of their thinking. But what has been the impact? So this is what their theory is, and it's wonderful, and it's all viva and what have you, but has it worked? To some extent, it has had an impact on theory. But I don't think that you'll see dependency theory appearing much in policy. At some point, it had some influences. This is a time when Youngman was writing. So there's some influence in the third world where Nyerere and Tanzania try to say, let's go an African route. Let's not look at at European models of socialism, etc. Let's build our own homegrown socialism here, which he did in Tanzania, right? And he wanted to go, like somebody was saying, back to the farms, etc. How do we develop peasant communities? How do we develop the kind of thing that Banker Roy is speaking about? The World Bank came along, and we need to look at what happened in Tanzania for us to understand what is possible, right? But they actually got kind of economically pushed under, and after a while they had to toe the line. That's the one group. The other is and then there's Chile. In Chile also they had a democratic revolution. So it wasn't a revolution by guns. It was a revolution through the ballot, and they decided they're going to adopt the Latin American socialist model, where everybody had agreed that we're going to go the socialist route. And what happened in Allende's Chile is that they simply, in fact, the neoliberal people supported him. Pinochet had a counter-revolution, and they just killed hundreds of thousands of people, and they squashed the democratic revolution, and they put in place, and in the name of democracy, they put in place a dictatorship. Right? So that they just destroyed the parliamentary route to socialism. Manly's Jamaica had a slightly different route, and there again things kind of fell apart. I think there were internal squabbles in Jamaica or something, I'm not sure, but eventually they would, What I think that happened is that people started to get involved in the politics. They started to institute what they call a regime change. Today they're calling a regime change, and they started to meddle in the politics of Jamaica. They did a similar thing in Guatemala, where they started to meddle in the politics of the area, and they started to do regime change. But they impacted on that particular revolution. They tried something as well. What's this guy's name? Somalia up that side. But anyway, this guy was executed because there was a policy. I think the CIA had a policy of foreign policy by assassination. So he got killed, but he was an African chap. I just forget his name. Lumumba. Right. So Lumumba was assassinated. So there's been an impact on theory, but there's been some influence on the third world. But in some ways it hasn't. Either it hasn't been allowed to happen, or it hasn't been possible for it to happen. All right. So we need to kind of go back to the drawing board and say, yes, even if we agree that they are right, maybe we need to think a little bit more difficult, through it a bit more. And part of the weakness of dependency theory is that it was the theory is right, and yes, it's beautiful and it sounds right, etc. But Youngman argues we didn't provide enough technical guidance for development planners. We didn't know after the revolution, how are we going to run the country? There are certain basic things that we need to know. So after then, this is what they told us during the boycotts. Our principal used to say, yes, if you have your revolution, that's fine. What are you going to do after the revolution? Where are your doctors going to come from? Where are your engineers? Where are your plumbers going to be? You need to have an education in order for you to run the new country. So even if we were to break free, will our people be ready to run this new free country? What kind of education do we need to do to have in order to prepare people for the future? And to an extent, Banker Roy are beginning to address that by teaching students how to run at a very young age already. Even in the technical education that they're providing over there, at a very young age, they're teaching people about citizenship, they're teaching people about democracy, they're teaching people how to run a country in the aftermath. So that's the impact in terms of policy. But in terms of education, it's had a huge impact on education. For example, Paulo Freire has been a big name, and he speaks about how do we educate people for liberation. So there's two kinds of education that Freire speaks about. The one is education for domestication, where you teach people how to be obedient workers. And the other one is education for liberation, where you teach people how to be free. What kind of education would we need in order to have education for liberation? What he calls a pedagogy of the oppressed. There's also been, and you will see this, there's been an argument against Eurocentric education. People are calling it now decolonization. And in particular, and you'll see elements of this in Banker Roy, though I don't think that he is a dependency theorist. I think he's the next group. But one of the things that Freire speaks about is he speaks about a culture of silence amongst the locals, where we remain silent. And he's starting to say that people on the ground, they need to start speaking the truth. What does Africa want? What does Africa believe? So you will see some of the ideas filtering through to people like Banker Roy and them. And thirdly, another part of this, and you'll see it in some of the dependent theorists, is it's not just about struggling against imperialism. It's also about dealing with the local power elites. So it's both an anti-imperialist agenda and an anti-local government agenda, because they people like them and people like Fanon, who you discover I'm a big fan of, they were starting to say that we need to be struggling against people who are, I was reading something on Africanism the other day. We need to be struggling against people who owe their first loyalty to Europe. And they were saying that the local elites, their power comes from their link to Europe, and so they owe their links to Europe, and they are not truly African. Because their power and their privilege comes from their ties to Europe. And so the Africanist agenda was always, I was just actually reading this yesterday, the Africanist agenda was saying that we need to bring power to people who have genuinely the interests of Africa and all Africans at heart. So it is both about struggling against the imperialists, against the puppets, and the imperialist masters kind of thing. Finally, in the last couple of minutes, there's a populist agenda. And I was going to ask you this question, but we're not going to have enough time. But in the populist agenda, and I suspect that Banker Roy falls within this agenda, is an example of how a populist would go about doing things. they were also critical, but in a different way, to dependency theory. They were critical of the way in which the World Bank and even before them, modernization theory had approached stuff. And they said, yes, it's not just about overthrowing imperialism. It's also about how do we empower ordinary people. And for them, development was about empowerment. They don't use the word empowerment, they use a different word. But it's basically that. And I don't think empowerment is the best word to use in any case. But it's basically about equipping ordinary people with their own voices. Allowing people, so this is the kind of thing that Bankaro is speaking about. And so within populism, there were kind of three critiques. The one critique came out of the feminist movement, right? Not your bourgeois feminist movement, your feminist movement coming out of your third world countries. And they were saying that this development that modernization gave, whenever there were development projects, after the development projects, things were worse rather than better. It's because other people were telling us what is good for us. We weren't part of the solution. And so they came with this a lot. They didn't even understand the problem. So they came with the wrong solution to the wrong problem. We understand the problems. People on the ground need to start making those decisions themselves. So that is the one thing. So they were saying that development, the way that, the way that people were seeing development and the top-down development thing just wasn't working. Secondly, there was the environmentalist movement. The environmentalist movement says that this whole notion of economic growth is just really, really a bad idea. Economic growth is what's going to kill the planet, because the more we develop economically and the more we modernize and the more factories we build, etc., the faster and the faster and the faster we will clear our planet. So people are modernizing, and what they're doing in modernizing the Europeans' idea of modernizing is building factories, is they're killing the forests, they're killing all the agricultural land. Somebody made the point that, we're taking people out of where they are and we want to go put them in the cities instead of having them develop where they are in ways that are environmentally friendly. This kind of stuff is bad news. It's a way, that is the way to petition. That is the way to destruction. So we shouldn't be looking at economic growth. Rather, what we should be doing is using what we have more better. So there's, to use Gandhi's words, there's enough in the world for human need, but not enough for human greed. So we need to have also a needs-based economy, but not in the same way that other people mean it. We need to go back to the people. We need to go back to the ground. We need to find more wholesome ways of doing things. The third problem that they have is what Youngman calls ethnoculturalism, where everybody was expected to believe that the values of Europe were the values of everybody, and it was better than everybody's values. So in some senses, I know the people, your predecessors have been arguing, they're saying that people were taught that African is inferior to European, that the way in which we see the world, is something wrong with it. All right. And so Eurocentric values are better, and they were questioning this. They were questioning what this effect has not only on self-esteem, but they were also questioning whether Eurocentric values were in fact better or whether it was actually a problem. Right? And then there was a fourth movement that came in. This is actually a European movement. It's postmodernism, where they said this whole notion of development is what they call a regime of representation. You have You have to think about that word a little bit. It's a way of representing the world. Like the Ukraine crisis, it's, there's a particular way in which the thing is painted for everybody, so that you can only do it in a particular way, right? I'm not pro Putin. Don't get me wrong, but I'm not pro NATO either. But when it comes to the whole question of representation, it's the way in which development is painted, and how it's painted is so that there's only one way in which we are allowed to think about stuff. TVT can only be TVT like we see it now. We can't think of it in any other way. And it's painted our minds into a box, and we have to stay in that box. And one of these ways is that they said that the conception of development is that it is Eurocentric, it's top-down, it's damaging the environment, we don't pay any attention to the environment, and it's destructive of rule society, as one of you said. That's the kind of development that is being promoted. And they're saying that maybe we need to overturn the word Eurocentric. Maybe we need to overturn the word top-down. In fact, populists would like to do. They'd say, let's overturn the word Eurocentric and let's replace Eurocentric with something else. Maybe Afrocentric. Let's overturn the word top-down and let's look at the bottom-up approach. Let's look at ways that are environmentally friendly, and let's look at how we can begin to build rural society. Because we speak about urbanization, should we be speaking about ruralization as well? Right. And part of the reason why they say this is that because in practice, modernization has shown that they have failed to meet the needs of the majority. Because the majority continues under modernization to remain poor and powerless. There's no evidence that modernization as a strategy for development works for the poor. There are a couple of people who benefit from it, but it's certainly not the poor people. All right. And let me just take another minute. So within, let me just see how far I've got, never mind. So within this, there's certain catchphrases that they would use. For example, you'll hear words like grassroots, the masses. Now the masses is different from the poor because the poor is somebody who you got to help. The masses is people who help themselves. Right? So there's a difference. It seems like the same word, but there's actually a difference. The neoliberals will speak about the unemployed. The modernizations will speak about the poor. It seems like they're speaking about the same word, but each word has a political connotation. It's got a political color. So their strategies would be things like community projects, self-help schemes, self-help programs, community development programs, the kind of things that Anke Roy is speaking about. And of course, you can see where this impact is around. That's mainly in your NGO stuff. And here is the thing about Anke Roy and them's projects, is that these projects are mainly on small scale and they're local. Can Anke Roy's model work on a national scale? Will it help Africa become independent, or will it just produce small-scale projects? And this is a question that you need to ask yourself. It's not a question that I can answer. But there has been an impact, especially on your grassroots education programs. There's a lot of those programs, but not in the state. It's mainly in your informal sector. We haven't seen them under the state adopt populist models, I don't think. So there have been things like the Barefoot Colleges. There have been Steve Biko started to work on some of those programs. There have been a couple of people-centered development programs. So there have been populist projects around, but mainly they've been weak. So there you have this on the one side, it's like a wrestling tag team. There's been modernization and neoliberalism. On the other side, there's been dependency theory and populism, which is a revisionist of the theory. And the reason why we're presenting all these models is that you can see that there are different ways of thinking about development, we've been sold one way. We've been sold a particular way. It's not necessarily the only way to think about this. There is, by the way, he's got a fifth theory, you know. It's this whole class analysis and speak about. It's almost to bring the language of dependency theory and populism into the 21st century. And you're looking at some of the new world, you know, because now it's not just West versus East, it's also China that's now gotten involved and stuff like that. Stuff like globalization. So there's this international division of labor. So there's a couple of new terms that we need to update. I think this is what Youngman is speaking about. We need to update populism. We need to update dependency theory. But I think that the basic ideas still remain the same. So there you have it. On the right, you have modernization and you have neoliberalism. On the left, you have populism and you have dependency theory. These are competing theories. And they're competing in terms of what are the catchphrases that they use, what are the strategies that they develop, what is their political agenda. And then also we need to consider, given all of that, given the ideology, what has been the impact? Can you see it at your college? All of the theories, because all the theories will exist in different ways at a college. What have been the weaknesses of these particular theories? And how have they begun to play themselves out? How do you witness them in your own program? Sorry guys, I've kept you a bit over time. So that's a lot. But I think that all that we want to do is to introduce you broadly to the idea of Youngman's article. You need to read the article yourself, but just to give you a quick summary, and a very bad summary perhaps. The modernizations say that social evolution needs to happen through the state. That's how we're going to change things. The state must do it. Liberalism says that the market must lead development. Underdevelopment theory says that Africa needs to become self-reliant. And populism says that the people themselves must lead from the grassroots. So that in a nutshell, in a very potted and incomplete nutshell, are the main ideological strategies being adopted by the four different movements. Thank you very much, everyone. Go and read Youngman.